Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning into our conversation on religious inclusion in the workplace. My name is Eric Ginsberg, and I'm the Senior Social Media Manager here at the Center for Creative Leadership. I'm really excited because today I'm joined by the Reverend Mark Fowler, sitting right here next to me, who is the CEO of Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. So today we're going to be learning about the great work that Mark and the rest of his team at Tanenbaum are doing to foster belonging at work and beyond. And we're also going to cover several actionable tips to help you make your organization a more inclusive place across religions and faiths. So, Reverend, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Eric, for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
So, Mark, to kick us off, can you tell our viewers, our audience, a little bit about yourself and who you are?
So funny, I was thinking about this earlier today. I was going to say, so I'm a Taurus and Aquarius rising.
Proud Libra over here. Yep.
But in all seriousness, I'm a native New Yorker, which I'm very proud of. I live in Brooklyn and also just want to acknowledge that I'm on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape Nation and to give honor to those ancestors and to the ongoing struggles of Indigenous people for equity. So that's just something I'd like to start with. I've been with the Tanenbaum Center for almost 16 years. Before that, I worked at another nonprofit around HIV prevention. And before that, I had a catering business. And before that, I was a public high school teacher for 11 years in the New York City school system. I'm very excited to be here with all of you, and it's a great pleasure to talk about Tanenbaum and our work.
Thanks so much, Mark. Another time when we have more time, I want to talk about your catering business because food is one of my great loves. I did not know that about you, but thank you for giving us that added context. So in a second, I want to dive into learning more about Tanenbaum and religious inclusion, the work that you all are doing. But first, I want to invite all of you who are watching, joining us today, share a little bit about yourselves in the chat too. Let us know where you're tuning in from. If you feel comfortable, share your faith tradition and maybe what you're hoping to learn today. So, for example, as you know, I'm Eric. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the United States. I'm Jewish, and today I'm really hoping to learn more about how I can deepen a sense of belonging for myself and my colleagues at work. So, Mark, let's dive in. What does Tanenbaum do? Tell us more about your organization.
Sure. So we are formally the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, easier to say Tanenbaum. We've been in existence for a little over 30 years. Our mission is to combat religious prejudice, to promote justice, and to build respect for religious difference. And we also think it's important to note that we are a secular and non-sectarian not-for-profit. So while our work is in providing solutions and recognizing the power of religion and religious identity and diversity in all of the areas in which we work, we ourselves are not a religious organization. So we look for ways for people to both build bridges, but to better understand one another in these areas in which we work. We've been doing our work in education, where we provide training and resources to teachers and school systems to create inclusive learning environments and to develop the social and emotional learning skills that students need to appreciate difference, including religious differences. We work in healthcare, where we provide training and resources both for clinical and non-clinical staff on the ways in which patients and families make decisions that are based in their religious beliefs and practices, and to bridge that communication gap so that we're not, that the medical community is not imposing beliefs on patients, but are weaving those beliefs into the patient care experience. We do work in peace building, where we identify and raise the profile of religiously motivated peace actors who work in conflict zones around the world. And our goal ultimately is to impact the way in which diplomacy is conducted so that in conflict zones and even in post-conflict zones, that religious actors who are working at the grassroots are those who are brought to the table and employed to actually bring about peace in sometimes intractable situations. And we also work in workplaces. For over 25 years. We've been working with global corporations, large not-for-profits, and government agencies around their policies and their practices, providing briefings for senior management, training for managers, as well as training for the workforce around the role that religion plays at work.
That's a really impressive scope of work, and thank you for outlining it for us. To all of you who are tuning in, obviously you can see why we at the Center for Creative Leadership wanted to bring Tanenbaum on today so we could benefit from your expertise. I see in the chat that you all are sharing about yourselves. Thank you. Keep that coming. Looks like a pretty wide range of different religions, faith traditions, geographies represented. So I'm excited to see that. And also just want to flag that our friends at Tanenbaum are in the chat with you, can answer some of your questions. I saw that the link came through to the website if you want to learn more. Hang out with us for a little bit longer and in this conversation, but then click over there afterwards, please. All right, so let's jump in. Mark, one of the things that you mentioned is that part of the work you do is related to workplaces. I know on your site that you outline 7 areas on a religious diversity checklist for organizations. Just at a high level, can you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Sure. So, one of the things that I think that's important to recognize is that everyone is in different places in their journey around addressing religious diversity in the workplace. For many years, I think a lot of people and organizations looked at addressing religion from a risk management perspective, which means that the only reason that they were paying attention to religion was so that they could avoid lawsuits. But certainly over the years, it has become clear and apparent that religious diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is a critical part of a DEI strategy. The 7 areas that we've outlined in our religious diversity checklist are kind of like that first place to look in terms of some of the places where religious diversity may be evolving or emerging. I think I would highlight a couple. One is in policies, and I think it's one that people don't often think about. Policies and practices often are the bedrock of how people understand equity around religious belief and difference in the workplace. But policies can often be kind of hidden, if you will, in that that document that you signed, that you looked at the staff policy manual and you will agree to do all of those things to be a good colleague. But unless something happens, then you don't look at that manual. So I think it's really important that companies take that moment to review their policies and practices, in particular as it relates to religious difference. We've done cultural audits with companies and had them actually create new policies around anti-proselytizing so that people are very clear about what the limits are around sharing one's faith within the workplace. Looking at time off policies, looking at attire policies, all of those are things that can impact someone's daily experience. And it can also impact recruitment and retention if for some reason you get the reputation of being a company that is intractable when it comes to the diversity of belief and practice and experience of workers. And I think I would also just highlight that holidays and time off and food are 2 areas that we saw a lot of reporting on. We did a national survey of the experience of the American worker and religious bias in 2013. And finding appropriate food at company-sponsored events and being able to secure time off for days of meaning were 2 of the highest reported areas where employees said that they were not being accommodated by their employers.
Thank you so much for raising all of those particular points. Hopefully that's helpful for you all who are tuning in to think about these different areas. I know for me, food and attire would not have been the first things that came to mind for me personally. So I'm glad that you mentioned those in particular. And obviously those are just 2 of the 7 areas on this list. Your colleagues shared the link in the chat again for people who want to dig a little deeper. I'm curious, for those of you who are tuning in, is your organization doing any of these things? Are there other inclusion practices around faith and religion that your organization has implemented? share those in the chat so other people can benefit and learn from the great work that you're doing, or maybe areas where you would like to see, like Mark mentioned, where there's a little bit of room for improvement. So as we talk through this, you mentioned that food and policies around time off are two of the biggest areas where people have identified either maybe they get tripped up or there's room for improvement. Sort of related to that, I want to talk about bias, and I know that Tanenbaum identifies 10 bias danger signs. We're going to share or your colleagues are going to share the link for that in the chat. Are there any that are most prevalent, like common areas where people get tripped up?
Yeah, and I would say that, I think it's important to bear in mind that whole dynamic of being on a journey. Because in some instances, I think people sometimes maybe get tripped up about something that they hadn't considered before. I would say in the last 5 years in particular, we have seen a huge increase in the numbers of companies that are members of our membership program who actually come to learn about and to launch interfaith networks or faith-based networks more broadly. And when I first started at Tanenbaum, like almost 16 years ago, networks were not something that we even recommended per se. We knew that there were a few, but it wasn't something that we said to people, this is something you should explore. Now, almost 16 years later, I think we're definitely in the space where we are working with more companies around their best practice and really kind of identifying what the business case is. You don't want to create a resource group of any kind to try and address some deficiency within the culture of the organization. There really needs to be a strong business case for any kind of employee resource group, and faith-based groups are no different. I would also say that ridicule of the 10 bias danger signs might be one that's kind of less thought of, but in the times in which we live right now, people are very, very sensitive about their identities. And I think kind of as an overflow or an indirect impact of George Floyd's murder, the ways in which global corporations are actually looking anew and very concertedly at how to address issues of bias and discrimination in society in addition to their workplaces. One of the outcomes of that have been people of various religious faiths being a little bit more vocal about the ways in which they are experiencing bias, prejudice, non-accommodation, sometimes by their colleagues, sometimes by clients. And so it has become an issue that we have to be far more aware of and sensitive to. And scheduling still remains, I think, one of large topics that people address. It is April. We are in the midst of an amazing intersection of the celebration of Passover, of Easter. We are in the holy month of Ramadan. We are also going to be experiencing the holiday of Vasiki. And in the midst of all of that, scheduling can sometimes be an issue or a concern in terms of people being able to take off time for days and celebrations that are meaningful for them. And I cannot tell you, in the almost 16 years that I've been working at Tanenbaum, how many Jewish colleagues talk about important meetings being scheduled during the high holy days, being scheduled during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and having brought it up, and they're just almost kind of no reaction, no action taken to address that. So those are the kinds of things where there's something that we can do, and to not do it almost implies that it's not important or it hasn't risen to the level of importance. And these are, I'm not saying that they're easy fixes, but they certainly are ones that are knowledgeable and that we can negotiate around and at least communicate to employees. If we're scheduling something on a day that we know is of significance to people, why are we doing that? And what's the accommodation that we're putting in place so that there's still full participation?
That makes a lot of sense, and I've certainly been in that position myself as someone who's Jewish. I'm curious. Um, I imagine that the answer probably depends on the specific organization, and as you said, there's sort of a continuum of where people are in this journey. Is there like a typical first best step that you recommend to organizations that are looking at this, or does it really all over the place?
Yeah, I think that there is a first best step, which is, this goes into, again, practice, right? Policy and practice. So those people who are responsible for scheduling, wherever they are within the organization, is there a multi-faith calendar that they are accessing on a regular basis that's a part of whatever system you're using, Google Calendar, Outlook? These, you can import holidays that make a difference either to your workforce, your clients, companies that you work for, locations where you have employees who are working. So incorporating that into your calendar and making sure that you are looking at that calendar when you're setting up training days, days where you're bringing managers together, celebrations throughout the company, all of that kind of stuff. And I do think that from a global perspective, there is an importance, whoever the majority is, to be mindful that there are people who are both your clients and your customers who do not celebrate or celebrate a variety of faiths. And it's important to be top of mind. Like, that level, when you're a majority in any particular group, there is privilege that comes with that, there's power that comes with that, and there's also responsibility that comes with that. So it shouldn't matter if religious minorities are not telling you that there is an important celebration coming up. As a corporate citizen, perhaps, I think it's important that we move to the place where we begin to pay attention to what matters to the people who are in our entire universe, not just who the majority are.
I'm so glad that you called that out. You know, your work is global. Center for Creative Leadership is a global organization. So I think it's important for us to, you and I are both here in the United States. We live in very different states and communities, but I appreciate you pulling that into the conversation. Uh, let's go a little deeper on that. I guess first, for the people that are tuning in, share what your experiences have been, and where you're based. Sort of how is all of this resonating with you, and then also, as always, ask your questions in the chat, and we will have a Q&A portion at the end. We'll do our best to address those. But Reverend, so what you're saying makes me think also about how creating a more religiously inclusive workplace doesn't just benefit people like me who are part of a religious minority in their community or work, but also people of every background, including folks who are in the majority in their respective workplaces. So can you talk a little bit about why this is for everyone and not
Yeah.
just for a smaller group of folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, that a design principle that we have when we're looking specifically at the topic of religious diversity as it relates to the workplace is that, not from a theological perspective, but from the practical aspect of religion at work, we look at the experience of employees and employers of an intersection between culture, belief, and practice. Really think about a Venn diagram of three circles where culture, belief, and practice are the intersection that each of us manages. We will find ourselves in different places at that intersection, even different depending on the day and depending on what happens to be going on in our lives at that moment. And the experience of someone's affiliation, whether they are religious or spiritually affiliated or not affiliated to any kind of religion or spiritual practice, is very unique. It's very personal. And there may be those who believe as we do, but our cultural experience may be different and the practices that we engage in may be different. So when we're creating policies and practices, we want to create policies and practices that are inclusive of the experience of as many people as possible, as much as the law will allow in the locations where we are. So when we're talking about and whether we're talking about the most devout believer or the most committed, non-affiliated person, we all have needs in the workplace that we're trying to manage. And one of the things that I think is really important as well is that um, when we talk about the unaffiliated population, or people who are not particularly religious or do not, ascribe to any tradition, they do have values. Everyone has values that they practice. They have days that may be meaningful to them. And again, that goes back to policies and practices. When you're thinking about time off, or paid time off, PTO as it's more commonly spoken about, someone may want to take time off to remember the death of a family member or a dear friend. And that may be as meaningful to them as a sacred day within a religious or spiritual practice. So I think we want to expand what we mean and who's included when we talk about religious belief and practice and inclusion in the workplace.
Yeah, I love that, and I appreciate you bringing that forward. I'm sure there are folks tuning in who feel like you're speaking directly to their experience. So, thank you for pulling that in. We touched on this, but obviously, respectful communication is a key part of the equation here. In addition to having those official policies in place at your organization, I know Tanenbaum has a competencies for respectful communication guide. So just quick aside for all of you tuning in, do you notice that I keep shouting out different resources that Tanenbaum already has built out that exists? I at least was really impressed by the full scope of different resources that you have for different scenarios and how these pieces all fit together. So just quick aside, had to shout that out. But so you have this competencies for respectful communication guide. Can you tell us a little bit about what that covers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing that I think would be important to share is that we purposely talk about them as competencies, because when we're talking about respectful communication as it relates to religious diversity in the workplace, each of us have those things that we may be more aware of, more conscious of. But then there are always places for us to grow and develop. So we think about these as areas, whether you are the CEO of the organization or someone who is just joining the company, that these are all practices, competencies that we can be mindful of and develop over time. They include avoiding assumptions, avoiding the spokesperson syndrome, where you have a person who is being asked to speak on behalf of everyone who believes as they do, or the other dynamic within that, which is when someone self-appoints themselves as the spokesperson for a group, kind of avoiding that dynamic. One that I think is really important, and we think is important at Tannenbaum, is practicing the platinum rule. Many of us are familiar with the golden rule, to treat others the way we would like to be treated. And in addition to that, we recommend practicing the platinum rule, which is to treat others the way they would like to be treated, and really finding out what matters and what's important to our colleagues, clients, and customers. Being curious and asking respectfully, listening actively, debunking stereotypes, which are all parts of other dimensions of increasing, I would say, understanding across a variety of identity areas. But one that I also think is really critical is the idea of addressing behavior and not belief. And often when religion or religious diversity identity comes up as a topic, the question becomes, how can I really have a conversation with somebody who I disagree with so fundamentally about their beliefs? In the workplace, one of the things that becomes really, really critical is, how is the person behaving? Because I can have all kinds of beliefs, but if I'm not treating you disrespectfully, if I'm not putting you in a place where you have to defend your beliefs, then I can just address the behavior that you're engaging in or that I'm engaging in, and not necessarily have to have arguments with people about their beliefs. And I think the last one that I think is critically important is acknowledging and apologizing for mistakes made. Because here's the thing, there is no one of us who is absent of the mistake when it comes to not understanding, perhaps really disrespecting someone or not being kind to someone. At some point, we're all going to step in it. As an organization that leads in this space, we do. So we do recommend that as a competency, that we really do begin to practice acknowledging when you've done something that was either offensive, and it doesn't have to be intentionally, being responsible for the impact that we have on one another and apologizing about that, and then hopefully starting again. And I think also having the humility to recognize that once you have offended someone, it may take some time before they're able to be willing to build bridges with you. So that's what I would say about our competencies.
Absolutely. That's very powerful. I see some of the comments that are coming through that people appreciate that differentiation for how someone's actually being treated, the action versus the beliefs. I was planning to ask you about, sort of how people should respond if incident of bias does occur. You just spoke to it beautifully, sort of if we are responsible for that bias. Is there anything that you would add if for someone who maybe witnesses religious bias, or let's say I'm a manager and someone confides in me that they have experienced bias in the workplace? What could I do? What could leaders do if it's not about correcting some, addressing, taking accountability for themselves?
Yeah, I thank you for that, because I do think it's important that if you are a leader, if you are a manager, this may be the first time that someone has come and shared this kind of experience with you. So it's really important to kind of take that moment, take that pause, check in with your HR lead and find out, first of all, what are the legal limits that we need to be mindful of? What are the internal policies that already exist within the company, and operate from those? Be in communication with the person who has brought this to your attention. Make it a confidential experience until it needs to be communicated externally, but be in communication with the person who's brought it up, because you don't want people feeling that they brought something up that was so meaningful to them and important, and that you're not paying attention to it or you're not taking action on it. And I do think that it's also really important that wherever we are in the world, that there are generally laws that guide workplace interactions around equity, particularly around the experience of bias or discrimination. And so that we want to work within those frameworks to make sure that people are, that their needs are being addressed and that their concerns are being addressed. Because I don't think anyone founds a company and says, we want everyone here to be uncomfortable and feel disrespected on a daily basis.
Absolutely. So to me, this seems like a natural place to transition to some audience questions. If you have not asked your question yet and you still want to, please go ahead and do that. We'll do our best to answer those. So to kick us off, we have a question here. Let's picture a small, it doesn't say this, but let's picture a pretty small organization or team. And the question is, what if everyone on my team is from the same religion? Like, how does this apply to me?
So the first thing that I would say is that I would definitely lean into that model of culture, belief, and practice, because even if you are a part of a small team or in a place where many people share the same belief, the experience of their cultural experience of that belief practice and the practices that they engage in may certainly be places where there is room for exploration. There's often more diversity within religious belief and practice than we allow for or that we think is possible, even in what occur as homogenous communities. And I also would consider, how do you approach and how do you address clients and customers who very well may not share the same beliefs and practices of the people in your company or the people on that small team? And how can you not just be sensitive, but educate yourself about what's important to them? What's important to them about either the product or the service that you're offering, or even time that they may not be available?
Great point. So we have another question here. How do you, it's a two-part question. How do you approach culture audits, and is there a best practice?
So, with cultural audits, one of the things that we often will do is work with usually the chief diversity officer, sometimes the chief human resources officer. We think it's important to interview members of the senior leadership team and senior management or the C suite to provide an opportunity for employees to anonymously talk about the experiences that the company has been taking efforts on to review the policies and the practices of the company. So going through the staff policy manual, going through the handbook, and then what we will do is create a report that we share with those people who have engaged us. In many instances, we have presented that information to a diversity team, which is often made up of senior leaders. And I'll just share this quick story. We did a cultural audit for a financial services company. And when we went to do the presentation and present the results, the chief executive officer of the company was sitting in that meeting. He chaired the diversity committee for the company. So this was the first time I was actually sitting at a table with the chief executive officer of anything. And I was not the CEO at the time. And part of the report that we shared was about employees being concerned about the space that had been identified for prayer and reflection during the day. And that it was small, that it was often confused for kind of like a single workspace. And the chief executive officer just kind of turned to someone at the table and said, "Can't we find another room?" Inside of a month, the new quiet room had been established with the recommendations that we made around posting the policies and practices so that there'd be no confusion as to what the use of this room was. So I do think it's always important to involve your C-suite and your senior leaders in these conversations.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate the specific example there. I think that will help people picture what this could look like. Another question for you. Do you, and I'm going to then build on it, do you have any advice for totally remote workplaces? So I'm thinking, like, when you're talking about some of these policies, obviously can, in terms of scheduling meetings, like some of those things obviously transcend location. But have you seen anything? This is me adding. Do you see anything come up in a remote environment that maybe people aren't used to running into, or is a new issue or opportunity that maybe doesn't come up as much in a physical in-person space?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So one of the things I think is important for us to remember is that the experience of working at home during the heights of the pandemic, and I happen to be one of those people who just kind of acknowledges the pandemic in a different phase as opposed to it went away, is that people were then in a position, in some instances that they had not been before, where their home became their background, as opposed to the walls of their office or a window that happened to be the fourth wall of their office. So you can see even where I'm speaking to you from my home, we are actually a remote office. We have a co-working space that we recently moved into at the beginning of the year. But you can see art in the background, all of those pieces. And they generally are religiously or spiritually inspired. Eric and I were talking about that before we started this session. And, someone might have a question about something that's on my wall. I definitely heard as we were doing work during the pandemic of people, sometimes their home became a part of themselves that they had not shared before. So I do think it's important to bear in mind that even with the hybrid work situations that we're involved in, some companies going totally remote, and remembering that before the pandemic, we were working remotely with sometimes teams of people who were in different places around the world, that if you have a question about what you see in someone's home, One of our competencies for respectful communication is, ask respectful questions. So, there's a kind of like this sense when someone is asking you a question out of genuine curiosity, as opposed to that question that they're asking to kind of confirm something that they think they already know. So, bear in mind that we're working in very personal spaces, sometimes in ways that we've not before. I've definitely seen that there are some companies that have a standard background that everyone is using, primarily so that you don't have to necessarily share the personal nature of your home. But if someone feels comfortable sharing their personal space, then be respectful about the fact that they are allowing you into a very personal dynamic in their home. And I do know that there are some companies that are definitely looking at policies around how to interact in the remote space that also include um, what background should be. One last thing I'll say about this. I think there's a potential for there have been more understanding about the time that someone may need to take away during the workday if they have to pray or observe, if prayer is a mandatory part of their practice. When someone is working remotely, that requirement on their life does not change. So whether they are observing prayer in their home or if they're going to a local house of prayer, we don't want to assume that because someone is working remotely that they no longer have the benefit of being able to observe their prayer practices during the course of the workday.
That's a great point. So I'm going to spin a question out of some of the things that I saw in the chat. So this didn't come through exactly, but earlier we were talking about the 7 areas on Tanenbaum's religious diversity checklist. You mentioned a few of them, but there was a lot of interest in the list. So this isn't an exact question, but I'm wondering if there are other parts of that list that you would want to go into more detail for that we haven't had time for yet today. And I can pick one if you want, but I'm going to let you field it. If just let me know if something immediate doesn't come to mind.
Sure. So one of them is dress or attire. And so we've definitely seen over the last 5 to 10 years as companies have actually been reviewing their policies about what does appropriate dress in our company and in our industry look like. We have seen more diversity in terms of people feeling comfortable bringing or wearing things that are their articles of faith or that directly impact or directly communicate some religious or spiritual affiliation. For some people, this is not negotiable. This is not something that, it's not just something to wear. It is an expression of who they are and an expression of their beliefs. I think it's important to educate oneself, educate security. If you are working in a hybrid sense about articles of faith, there has sometimes been unnecessary interactions with people whose outward expression or their attire may cause concern. And we really do want to work with people, work with security in our buildings to find out what's the actual concern. And is this an authentic concern or is this something that might be based in a bias? Other areas that we talked about was office space in terms of the religious diversity checklist. So how is the office space actually set up? Do you have space to create a quiet room? And there are a lot of companies as they're renegotiating how they're working in a hybrid situation, sometimes moving into other locations. Do we have space for a quiet room? Where is it going to be? Do we have space where people can observe ablutions or ritual washing before prayer? These are all things as we're kind of like transforming where we work and how we work. These are topics that can also be included. And the last one that I would say that also show up in our 10 bias danger signs is just kind of religious practice. One of the things that we think is really, really critical is that, at this point, it's not so much a question of whether or not you're going to address religious diversity. The real question is how and when. And the business case, I think, has already been set. So we just think it's really critical to kind of put aside the question of if we should be talking about religious diversity, but really advance the question of how are we going to do this and when are we going to address it?
I love that. Not if, but when and how. So, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But if you have more questions for Mark or want to connect with Tanenbaum, you can follow the link in the description for this video to learn more or get in touch with them. We haven't mentioned this yet, but so I want to give you opportunity for a quick plug. You have a conference coming up that you want to invite people to, and we've been so lost in this great discussion that we didn't mention it. Please tell people about it.
My staff would kill me if I didn't. So, though we're very honored that we've been hosting the Religious Diversity Leadership Summit. We'll have our seventh one on May the 10th. We are very generously being hosted by Citi's corporate offices in Manhattan. It will both be in person, and you'll also be able to participate remotely. So there will be virtual access to the conference. And yeah, I hope to see you there. It's a very meaningful time, and we are very excited to have Farouk Kathwari, the CEO of Ethan Allen, as our keynote speaker, as well as a number of other people working around religious diversity and leadership. So I believe that there are two separate registrations, one for in-person and one for remote or virtual, and we hope to see you there.
Great. I'm glad that we managed to fit that in. Speaking of upcoming events, CCL, Center for Creative Leadership, has a virtual event later this month. And one of the core focuses of that event, which is free and online, is about belonging at work. So we're not going to be getting into, we're not going to be focused on religion, but this is part of a larger conversation about creating belonging at your workplace. So we're going to share that link in the comments as well. Definitely go to Tanenbaum's conference too. It sounds a great opportunity.
I forgot to say that the summit is free, and thank you to all of our sponsors. And if you want to sponsor, we can give you that information as well.
Great. We got, we got to get those quick plugs in.
Got to get those
all
in.
of you listening. So, but obviously there's tremendous value to all of you in attending as both of these events as well. Reverend, thank you for being here today and for sharing your expertise with us. I learned a lot. I'm seeing in the comments there are people saying I hadn't considered this before, that it was very informative. So I just want to echo all of that and say our audience really appreciated this. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for having us. We appreciate it.
Great. Well, so before all of you tuning in, before you leave, please share this conversation with your network so we can amplify all of these important insights and perspective and takeaways and actionable learnings for what you can do to make your organization more inclusive. Also, one last plug, follow our friends at Tanenbaum on social media if you're not doing that already. Thank you all for tuning in. Bye, everyone. Hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.